Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the country meeting on today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and elders and community members who are here today. My name's Darren Smith. My people are the Pyro Mariner from the northeast coast of Tasmania. I have the privilege of being the Chief Executive Officer of Aboriginal Housing Victoria during this very important part of our journey. I'd like to talk to you today about Aboriginal Housing Victoria's journey to self-determination and the transfer of 1,448 properties to Aboriginal Housing Victoria. Today, Aboriginal Housing Victoria owns 1,078 properties and manages a further 463 properties for the Director of Housing. On 1st of July next year, all going well, the final 464 properties will transfer to Aboriginal Housing Victoria. I'd like to talk about the process of transfer and what we've learnt from it. For those of you that don't know AHV, AHV is a company. It's not a government agency like the Aboriginal Housing Office. We're an independent company regulated by ASIC and the ACNC. The Aboriginal community that we serve is highly dispersed, and so are the properties our tenants live in. 2/3 of our properties are in regional Victoria, from Cairn River on the New South Wales border to Mildura to Portland. As a consequence, AHV has offices right across Victoria. There's a significant population in our houses. We estimate that it's about 8% of Victoria's Aboriginal population. And of those tenants that live in our houses, roughly 40% are single mothers, and we also have a large number of elders and other parents whose children have left home. Our journey began over 35 years ago. The Aboriginal Housing Board of Victoria was formed in the early 1980s. It grew out of recognition of the need to address the appalling housing condition of many Aboriginal Victorians, many of whom were homeless and still camping on riverbanks. It began as an advocate for tenants and moved quickly to influencing policy and practice. The first milestone to title transfer was achieved in 2008 when Aboriginal Housing Victoria became a registered housing provider. At that time, all Aboriginal tenants in public housing were given a choice to have their tenancies managed by Aboriginal Housing Victoria. About half, or 1,300 at that time, agreed and to have their tenancies managed by AHV, and the Director of Housing leased their properties to us. In 2013, we took on responsibility for repairs and maintenance. That's not refurbishments of properties or upgrades. And in March 2015, the incoming Labor government communicated to us that they were genuinely committed to the title transfer. The transfer was based on the Victorian Government's self-determination policy agenda. The first question for us was, what did that actually mean in terms of the transfer? Housing associations in Victoria were established as housing growth vehicles, and what self-determination meant was that we didn't need to demonstrate growth or to borrow funds. There was a very short time period when we had to negotiate with the Director of Housing and the Housing Registrar the terms of the transfer, and it was very clear very quickly that we would be required to become a housing association. We would have to take the properties in the conditions that they were in, and that we figured we had 9 months to do it. It was very important at that time that we established a process for communicating, receiving guidance and feedback with the Director of Housing and the Housing Registrar. I'll go through some of the more important issues that we worked on as part of our application to become a housing association. The first one was our governance. We needed to ensure that in order to get the confidence of the Housing Registrar, that we had the governance to manage housing as a business. In 2013, the Constitution of Aboriginal Housing Victoria was amended to provide robust oversight and reduce vulnerability to community politics. We developed a skills-based board, including skills and experience in community housing, financial and legal capability as well. It is a majority Aboriginal board, but it has non-Aboriginal members as well. Leading up to the transfer, we commissioned a review of the board governance through the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and one of the key findings coming out of that was that we needed to look at how we incorporated on our skills-based board asset management, planning, development and finance expertise as well, financing. We worked on our internal capability. We established and built a strong executive management team, creating directors for finance, policy and strategy and operations. We also worked on our community engagement. We developed a community engagement strategy and committed to twice a year meeting with tenants and local communities in 12 locations across Victoria. Community engagement links closely to governance, and it's still something that we're continuing to work on right now. We engaged an independent consultant to review and finalise our application. The consultant was from the community housing sector, was experienced in preparing housing association applications, and had an intimate understanding of the concerns of the housing registrar. We reviewed and updated policies and procedures. Tenancy, maintenance and repairs and management probity policies and procedures were sound and in place and only need to be tweaked. We needed to review financial delegations and approvals and update them for asset management transactions. When we went through that process, we found that there was no discernible difference in the performance standards between being a provider and a housing association relating to tenancy, management, maintenance and community engagement. The aspects of the performance standards that relate to the business activities as a property owner were the key changes needed to be made. Oops. The critical concern of the Housing Registrar and the Director of Housing related to demonstrating ongoing financial viability and in particular managing the long-term costs of maintaining the property portfolio in an adequate condition. 80% of our effort went into development of our asset management. We did the things that you'd expect us to do. We developed an asset management policy, a strategy, a long-term business plan, and linked and integrated it with our business planning. We developed long-term capital renewal projections based on condition-based component renewal life cycle forecasts. A fancy way of saying that we were able to predict what the costs of all the repairs were in the long term for all of the properties. We spent a lot of time analysing those capital renewal costs because the first thing that we realised was if we didn't do something differently, we couldn't actually afford to repair the properties. We developed 15-year financial projections incorporating the capital renewal costs, and we demonstrated ongoing financial viability. We updated our risk management plan and our risk register, focusing on asset management related risks. And importantly, we commissioned an independent review and report on all of the work that we did around asset management. It was delivered by the property asset management team of one of the big four consultancy teams, and it was critical to gaining the confidence of the housing registrar and the director of housing. So some of the things that we learned. This almost sounds pretty flippant and superficial, but it's very important for housing providers to take a business approach to their housing programs. One of the things that we realised fairly quickly is the costs can sneak up and surprise you very quickly. It's also very important for our tenants that we have clear policies and procedures and fairness and consistency of practice. With our tenancy management, we needed to focus on how we reduce damage to properties, how we ensured rent was paid by tenants, and we needed to make sure we had the right team structure in place and supervision of our housing officers, which is critical to consistency of practice. It is quite important for us because 75% of our housing officers are outposted in offices where they're one on their own or with only one other housing officer. With our maintenance, we needed to make sure that our back-end finance and work order systems and processes for processing large number of transactions was in place. We needed to make sure that we had good contract management for managing tradies and contractors. One aspect that's often overlooked is it's absolutely critical that you have an integrated housing management IT system. Most systems don't do all the job. The two most common issues are that the finance and housing systems are not well integrated, and the asset management modules are often pretty poor. We spent a lot of time making sure that our finance and our housing systems were well integrated. Scale is a really important issue. There's a rule of thumb that you need at least one housing officer to 100 tenants in order to actually pay for that position. It does depend on how vulnerable tenants are managed and supported. In AHV, we're working at the moment on about one housing officer to 130 tenants. One of our observations in talking to the other Aboriginal community organisations in Victoria that provide housing services is that if you have less than 100 properties, you will find it very difficult to afford and to retain in-house tenancy management expertise, to achieve cost-effective maintenance and repairs, and to have access to asset management expertise to know if your housing program is running at a profit or a loss, to plan your portfolio for the future. But there are ways to account for scale in a distributed ownership model. Another finding that we made during the process was that the housing performance standards do not account for Aboriginality. There is no recognition of the higher level of disadvantage faced by Aboriginal people, Aboriginal cultural values and practices that have implications for governance, requiring a higher level of accountability and engagement, Aboriginal cultural values and practices that have implications for how tenancy management and support services are delivered. These all have costs and performance implications for Aboriginal housing providers. We know from self-determination evidence that cultural fit is hard, particularly for statewide providers, because we are obligated to engage locally across all communities in Victoria. Our observation, and it's pretty obvious, is that you start with the values and look at the nature of the business. We're still working on it. We are now thinking long term. The risks of ownership over a long period and the need to plan how to manage your assets to minimise these risks bring clarity to your thinking. While the Housing Registrar's requirement to demonstrate financial viability over a 15-year period drove the detailed asset management planning, it also forces a housing organisation to think long term. It directly challenges us to better understand demand for housing. In our asset planning, we are recycling 20% of our properties. That means we are selling or demolishing 300 properties over 15 years. We're also building over 300 properties in 15 years, and that's an investment of approximately $100 million. So if that's the scale that we need to work on, we better make sure that they're actually built where the community needs them. They also better suit the needs, characteristics and aspirations of the people who will be living in them. It also causes us to be clear about what we deliver Or another way, what we can afford to deliver from tenants' rent, and what other support is needed that must be funded or delivered elsewhere. And finally, thinking about what the outcomes we take responsibility for causes us to think about what value we add as an Aboriginal housing agency, what we deliver that a real estate doesn't, what we deliver that a mainstream community housing agency can't. For us, the value add is in forming strong local relationships with Aboriginal cooperatives to deliver integrated support services to tenants. That is the mental health, family violence, child and community services, alcohol and drug services that many of our vulnerable tenants need. There are other value adds. We get access to mainstream capital grants that no other Aboriginal organisations in Victoria get access to. We can form development partnerships with other housing agencies. We can also proactively work on better aligning our stock to needs. The value add that we're excited about working on is to work with tenants and households on achieving their aspirations in a coaching approach. And it's a clear gap in Victoria where there's no one that actually works with Aboriginal people or communities, or very few people, around how they're actually going to achieve their aspirations. The value add depends on the service system, what we already deliver, and will be different, most likely, in New South Wales for your organisations. I'll leave it there.